Welcome to the ACT podcast. I'm Lizzie, and in this episode, we're going to be thinking about education in Scotland. Now, ACT does operate in the devolved nations, but we do have the majority of our members and the majority of our work focused on England. So it's a great opportunity for us to think about what it means to live out a faithful Christian witness in schools in Scotland. With insight from Christian Values in Education Scotland, we'll be discussing with Megan and Lynn, so Megan Patterson and Lynn Macmillan, what it means to be a Christian teacher in Scotland and how they can serve wisely and confidently in Scottish classrooms. So welcome, Megan and Lynn. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Lizzie.
Great. Can you tell us then, just to begin with, just a little bit about CV Scotland, what you do?
So thank you, Lizzie, for this opportunity to share a little bit about the work of CVE Scotland, and it's a great opportunity to do so. So my name's Lynn Macmillan and I'm the Outreach Administrator, and I've been working for CVE Scotland now for around about a year and a half. Now, CVE Scotland, for those of you who may be not aware of us, we are a Scottish charity established in 2014. I guess you could say is a little sister organisation of SU Scotland. And really our whole heartbeat is to inspire and encourage teachers and school staff to confidently live out their Christian faith in the classroom. We believe that we're the only charity focused on the Christian adults working exclusively in Scottish schools. And with our values of community through encouragement and compassion and integrity, we hope to serve those school staff who are feeling the opportunity they wish to share their faith, however feel perhaps burdened in doing so. We have taken on a new focus this year, whereas previously we also had Steve Younger, who was our chaplaincy coordinator. Steve's now retired after great service with CEV Scotland. Therefore, our focus is now exclusively on the adult staff working in schools who wish to live out their Christian faith.
Fantastic. And in a moment, we'll think a little bit more about how you do that, about the place of Christianity, Christian witness, particularly of those adults working in schools in Scotland. But just to kind of give some of our members a little bit of the lay of the land. And as I said earlier, majority of our listeners will probably be based in England. I just want to try and understand perhaps what it is like to be a teacher in Scotland and what it is as well to be a student in Scotland. Now, obviously, we have education is a devolved matter. So we have schooling in England that looks very different to schools in Scotland. And I think I only started to realise this in its entirety over the last year or so. Because there are completely different curriculums, different provision for schooling, the way that students are allocated to schools, the way that schools are funded, who has control of curriculum, etc. Could you tell me perhaps maybe first of all about curriculum for excellence? Can you tell me much about that? Because in England we have the national curriculum that is quite organised, quite traditional. Can you tell me much about the Curriculum for Excellence?
Yeah, so Curriculum for Excellence was introduced around about 2010, and it's currently going through a revision of that process. So things will be changing in the years to come. But it is a very broad and flexible, perhaps less rigid than it is down in England. And it emphasises skills for learning, life and work, with a number of compulsory subjects, and then there are also core subjects, and then there's optional subjects within that. And I believe that it's regarded that Scotland have greater autonomy to tailor that content to pupil needs and interests. So Scotland's approach is often described as being more generalistic and broader, whereas I believe in England it tends to be more specialised and deeper. Now, I say that as coming from my previous career in teaching a specialism in business education, but that was tends to be within the upper school. With regards to school stages, primary school in Scotland starts in what we call primary one, approximately ages 4 to 5, though there is flexibility to request that children go into school slightly later than maybe standard. I know I actually did that with my own younger son. And then they go on to secondary school, what we call secondary 1 to S6, from ages 12 to 18.
So starting school sounds very similar, and I suppose the age that you go to secondary school. So you say you don't start secondary school until the age of 12?
Yes, between 11 and 12, it
Oh,
just
between
depends.
okay.
Yeah, I was 11 when I started, but yeah, between 11 and 12.
Sure. And of course, and so I'm just trying to get in our mind because when I hear things about hires or advanced hires, I'm always thinking, well, what does that equate to? But it doesn't necessarily equate to exactly the same things. So obviously in England and Wales, we would have GCSEs at the end of year 11. So the end of so when you're 16, what qualifications would a student come out with at the end of their school career in Scotland, and what age would that be?
So maybe help clarify that. In our primary schools, we go from primary 1 to primary 7. And we have the opportunity for preschool, obviously, as well. But when they go into what we call secondary 1, aged approximately 11 and 12, they currently have 3 years of broad general education. However, schools have and the local authorities have the opportunity to tailor that slightly. So, for example, in my own school, we narrowed down the options between secondary 2 and secondary 3, down to less subjects, and then that was narrowed down further when they got into what we call secondary 4 or S4. Now, in S4, approximately aged between 15 and 16, our students can study for what we call national qualifications, roughly equivalent to your GCSE level subjects. Dependent on the confidence the pupil in the subject, they can have it at National 5 or National 4 or National 3. And at 16, between 16 and 18, our students can take what we call higher subjects. Now, these are usually the currency to get into university. They can take up to usually 5 or 6 in S5 subjects, that is. But they can go on and specialise further in their last year of school and take advanced hires, which are roughly comparable to your A levels. However, because not everybody takes advanced hires, they may wish to increase the number of other subjects they have at higher. Our universities will tend to express entry at university for the number of hires that they have and the qualification level that they've taken at the grade that they were awarded.
Okay. And how many hires would a student come out with then at the end?
It is very, very varied, Lizzie. Your student who's aiming for university would probably aim to take 5 subjects in their S5 year. That would tend to be English and maths, and then the subjects of their choice. However, that can vary dependent on the school setting. I should also say that currently our awarding body has just changed. We were called the Scottish Qualifications Authority, or the SQA, and it's now called Qualifications Scotland as of this year.
Okay. So you see, already my mind is boggling. There are so many differences. And
Can I just interject something there, Lizzie, about the
Yeah.
curriculum for excellence?
Yeah.
Because it sometimes is, well, it's often viewed by teachers quite negatively, largely because it was thrust on them and they didn't have adequate help in actually delivering it. But there are 2 very positive things about it, I think. One is the freedom, at least. Well, of course, it'll depend on individual schools, but very often there's a lot of freedom in what you can teach, so long as you meet the benchmarks. And the other thing is, and it's something I loved in the classroom, was the interdisciplinary emphasis. So that, for example, as a modern languages teacher, I was, according to the curriculum for excellence, had complete freedom to be a geography teacher and a math teacher and a home ec teacher within the confines of the curriculum for the modern languages, which was wonderful, I felt. So, I don't know, thrilling for a Christian teacher to be able to teach across the disciplines in a way which reflects God's creation, really, of all things. So there are positives in the curriculum for excellence, I think, broadly speaking, in terms of freedom and interdisciplinary emphasis.
Sure. That's really interesting. So, and I find the idea, because there's such a rigid, particularly when you get up to GCSE sort of year 9, 10 onwards, so 13, 14 years of age onwards, there is such a rigid expectation, I would say, in subject areas that you teach to an exam, and everything in those 2 or 3 years is tailored towards getting through the curriculum, which is substantive and knowledge rich. And there's not, and I personally like the idea of knowledge rich curriculum. However, I can also see the very holistic approach, almost centered approach, and perhaps the beauty of that in certain contexts of being able to tailor to your students, perhaps having more of that local emphasis as well, or of being able to draw on issues or topics that, as you say, are very interdisciplinary. And I suppose, is that a good thing for people engagement? And how do you, without that kind of stipulation, that very clear stipulation there, how do you meet benchmarks? It's not about the stuff, but it's about the standards. So how do you, sorry, I'm just, again, as a teacher trained very much in the English sector, it's hard for me to kind of get my head around.
Well, the benchmarks are quite well defined, I would say. I mean, wouldn't you, Lynn? You know, we seem to have lots of boxes to tick.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it's education after all, isn't it?
It certainly was a big issue as I was leaving my teaching career with regards to how we achieve the experiences and outcomes. And there was a lot of working between schools within a local authority area to peer assess, if you like. If I felt a pupil was achieving a certain level, was that the same understanding from my colleague in another school? So I would say that, yeah, there has been a lot of freedom. Some people argued that it was too much freedom and people were reinventing the wheel in different schools right across Scotland, particularly in my own subject area. However, the advantages were definitely, as Megan has said, were there. There's the ability to tailor it to your local setting, to like involving local partners as well. I should have also said that, you know, RME is one of the curricular areas within Scotland, but again, I can't see how it is in England. But in Scotland, we have the religious observance, which is separate from religious and moral education, which is an academic subject that you can go on and study to different levels.
Okay, so great. So let's move on to that. So RME, religious and moral education. So that, I presume, so that's an academic subject. I presume that would be the same or the similar framing as religious education in England and Wales. Tell me a little bit about that then. How is that provided? And is that curriculum, is that something that is sort of stipulated, or again, is there quite a lot of freedom there? Because I can't even begin to tell you about England and Wales because it's so complicated. It's ridiculously complicated. So I'd love to know what Scotland does.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm not an RME teacher, so apologies for those listening who feel that I'm slightly veering off. But the RME within schools, and I should say non-denominational schools, because within Scotland we have the denominational sector, that's the Catholic education sector, and that's again slightly different. For within religious education in Roman Catholic schools is distinct from RME. And it's called Religious Education in Roman Catholic Schools, or RERC, and it follows a separate set of experiences and outcomes developed under the guidance of the Scottish Catholic Education Service. So if I focus on in the non-denominational sector in RME, they have experiences and outcomes that run throughout from primary, in fact from early years, right through till before they take the academic subject. And Christianity is but one viewpoint that they can focus on. However, we like to, in CV Scotland, like to encourage our teachers within Scotland to really explore those E's and O's and consider how it can be a way of bringing in stories about Christ, about the Bible, that is not regarded as being evangelical to them, but is teaching it within the confines of the E's and O's, but at the same time being able to show the teachings and life of Jesus. When it comes to the academic subject, there are options of religions that the students can study, and it isn't necessarily Christian. In fact, I would think that in most cases it's not Christianity they choose to study on because they have had that input earlier on. I can only again speak from my own experience in my school that it wasn't Christianity that was the main focus there.
That's really interesting because in England and Wales, the law provides that the main teaching in RE should reflect the fact that the UK has a broad Christian tradition, and that should be make up, or the teaching should reflect that, as well as teaching other religions as well, right through, unless you are a school with a particular religious character, then you would be allowed to teach according to your so for example, there are Muslim schools in England and Jewish schools as well, and although most of those schools would potentially choose, say at GCSE, to teach a second religion, every other school would have to teach Christianity and then other religions as well. So I find that very interesting, and there's also provision for local groups. In fact, it's stipulated that there have to be standing advisory councils for RE and agreed syllabus conferences, which mean that local religious groups, including Church of England, other Christian denominations, and then other religions as well, agree a syllabus, which is a very, very complex beast. But I find it interesting. So Christianity wouldn't necessarily have a privileged place in religious and moral education then in Scotland.
Not in the academic subject taken from in S4.
No, okay.
So that's the difference between religious observance and RME.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about religious observance in Scotland, because I imagine that's, again, similar to what we would call in England the daily act of collective worship, which every school, whether they have religious character or not, are obliged to have. And again, that has to be in the main Christian. So yeah, what happens in Scotland?
It is very much a changing emphasis over the last 20 years, where it's time for reflection. And I'm just actually looking here at some publications I have. It's now called Time for Reflection, and that in itself is omits the word Christianity. However, it doesn't mean that it can't be part of religious observance within schools, or the equivalent of the assembly time. So we would like to see that, the values and issues of Christianity are very much part of that. However, it is no longer regarded as being a solely Christianity, and that can be very much dependent on the head teacher of the school. Certain cases, the local authority as well, but it is very much within the head teacher. And we've been encouraging local churches to be involved in their local schools, because Scottish education does value the input of the local community context. And if churches within the local community can do so, they can approach the schools and ask to be involved within the religious observance time, or as we call it, time for reflection.
And how does that generally, are there good partnerships between local churches and, say, teachers or head teachers, or is that something CVE Scotland sort of do in terms of helping to link them up and get the right people in the right places?
Partnership is a requirement of Scottish schools.
Okay.
So the How Good Is Your School document, if you read that, you can see that schools are, they're required to partner with the community. And so that is an opportunity for churches to be involved.
Sure. And tell me a little bit about the role of chaplain, because as I understand it, the chaplaincy role has much more of a significant part to play in Scottish schools than perhaps it does in English schools.
Schools do have chaplains in Scotland.
I would say it's still very much dependent on how active the chaplain is, and also
Sure.
the senior management team within the school, how welcoming they are to that taking place. So there isn't one particular answer I think would fit every school.
Sure.
It's some schools will have them involved in the heart of decision making in some cases, and others will. It's maybe a token chaplain title. And when it comes to working within schools, there's an organisation called Serve Your Local School in Scotland, who, if you can get onto their website, you can see ways they encourage churches to have a greater involvement within their local schools. And we would wholeheartedly support that, because it's building these relationships and this ability for children to know there is a Christian presence within their school community, and that that can be carried out beyond the school day.
Sure. Now, would you say that is something, because from a very outside perspective, it would perhaps be easy to comment that Scotland seems to be secularizing faster than England in some ways. And I suppose just, a few kind of indicators like the removal or the non-requirement for assemblies to have, not that it's outlawed, but the non-requirement for assemblies or to have those observances that have any Christian character at all. How would you say that's impacting sort of school culture, or would you say that that's a concern for Christians and Christian staff in particular in schools? Or is it something that perhaps has just shifted gradually in your perspective, and you're just trying to make the most of the opportunities you do have?
I think it's possibly worthwhile mentioning just now, one of the recent changes, very recent changes, is Scotland have adopted the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was July last year. And part of that is a recent consultation on whether pupils have the right to remove themselves from religious observance. And that was a big differentiation. It wasn't RME as such, it's a religious observance, even though that might not be the desire of their parents. Did children have the right to do that? Now, that has been implemented or brought in, but how it's going to be actually implemented remains to be seen. How will schools be able to deal with a pupil, and at what age are they regarded as being able to knowledgeably take that decision, make that request, and then allow them to be removed from religious observance or time for reflection, as we call it. I think that's a very moot point for a lot of schools at the moment, but through the adoption of the UNCRC. So that is something that's very different to Scotland, as I understand, to England at the moment.
Absolutely, you're right. But what's very interesting is that I have seen, particularly with the National Secular Society, they are pushing for that in England as well. And as you say, Scotland have adopted that. Are schools then communicating this, very explicitly to students? Are they saying, you now have the right to withdraw from this observance? Are they communicating that to parents to then communicate to their children? How do they go about kind of notifying that there's going to be some kind of religious observance that they then have to give a child the option to opt out of? It's more complex. I mean, I have seen it. And I think at the moment in England, parents have the option of withdrawing their child from active collective worship. Very, very rarely is that enacted. And actually, it would tend to only be particular sects, say Jehovah's Witness, or perhaps those in a very tight brethren network, exclusive brethren. So yeah, I think that'd be interesting. Have you got any information or data about how that is being observed now, or is that something you're still waiting?
It's still so very, very new, and whether or not, yes, pupils are made aware of the right, or whether it's just there in the background, and they will deal with the individual pupils as they make their request known. But no, there's nothing that I could talk knowledgeable about how at the moment it's actually being implemented.
Sure. And it'd be interesting to see whether schools are required to collect data on that as well. So yeah, no, interesting. Something to watch. So let's get to the crux of our conversation, because obviously at ACT and now your kind of renewed focus, your main remit and our main remit is to support staff, to support teachers primarily, but both of us have a heart to support any adult that is working or volunteering in school that is a Christian who wants to be a wise but courageous Christian witness in a school environment. What would you say then are the main challenges and opportunities for Scottish Christian teachers or staff?
I think for most Christian workers, I think first and foremost with your colleagues, for them to know that your faith, for them to know that who we stand for, who we serve, with the knowledge that can actually raise red flags with some other members of staff who are perhaps more vigilant to see your every interaction. So, for example, and I'm sure many teachers will be familiar with this, you had a very particularly bad week, you're in the staff room at lunchtime on the Friday, you're exhausted, and people start to complain about a particular instance, whether it's a particular pupil or the way something's been handled. And, as a Christian teacher, to be constantly aware of eyes watching you and to see your reaction. And whilst you might still be weary, you might have agreements with how things have been mishandled, but to be able to shine Christ's love amongst all of that is very much a concern for teachers, but it is the concern I know for workers in many other industries as well. But within the staff room in schools, that can be a challenging situation.
Yeah, sure. And, I think that'd certainly be the same for teachers on the other side of the border. That kind of culture of staff room disgruntlement, complaining, perhaps backbiting. And depending what department you're in, I'm thinking secondary here, it can be worse than others. So I suppose, obviously, there's the general or the Christian focus kind of, you're being watched, you're being observed to see, if you do have integrity, your behaviour does match up to your words, to what you believe. Taking a step back, though, I'm just thinking about school culture, education culture, not just staff room culture, but in England, we're seeing most teachers have quite a short lifespan in school once they qualify. I think it's something on average about 5 years. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to things like workloads, pay settlements, etc., perhaps behaviour of students, would you say there are challenges on all those fronts? I mean, I'm thinking, I've got friends and colleagues who have just in the last year or so, after, having a very distinguished and very successful career, have said, I just can't cope anymore. My stress levels are up to here and I will not survive another year. In fact, I had one friend who quit at the very beginning of the year. Would you say that that's similar, that kind of stress, workload, that they're similar in Scotland, the pressures?
Yes, absolutely. There was a recent survey of senior management within Scotland and the results showed quite significantly how many were planning to retire much earlier than standard retirement age. So that there are concerns with senior management and all teaching staff about them having burnout and having a limited teaching career. When it comes, you mentioned pay is slightly higher in Scotland. Interestingly, that's brought its own issues that put teachers at the higher scale, but baseline classroom teacher on the higher scale, who are now in the higher tax bracket in Scotland. So that in itself. And without being realistic here, it's also affected the number of teachers who are willing to mark exam papers, because the tax rate that they're being applied to their earnings to that is so high. But that's maybe an aside. When it comes to workload, absolutely, there's the same issues, I believe, between our different devolved nations. We actually had our main teaching union, the EIS, the Educational Institute in Scotland, they actually just stepped down strike action in the last week that was about to be taken because of promises that had been made with regards to contact time in classrooms. So that there is a major factor within Scotland, that the workload issues, and it's something we at CV Scotland, pray for, that teachers can learn to manage that burden and be able to look to Christ for that resilience to keep going when things feel particularly burdensome. Because we believe, for teachers in the classroom who profess Christ as Saviour, that might be the only interaction these children will have with a Christian. And, we desire to have more Christians within education. So, answer your question, yes, it's similar to what you're dealing with down south. When it comes to behaviour management, as I understand, our emphasis is much more on restorative practices with dealing with behaviour management in the classroom, and that can bring its own struggles as well. Being able to remain calm when you're dealing with situations of misbehaviour, being able to take the steps that the school have asked you to take, but at the same time feeling that there must be sort of justice with how situations are being dealt with.
Okay, so that's interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about restorative justice? Because as again, over the past year or so, I've been reading about trends in the devolved nations. As I'm aware, Scotland doesn't tend to exclude or permanently exclude any students. It tends to be just a cultural sort of taboo, whereas in England, that wouldn't be the case. And I'm not trying to say one is better than the other, but how are some of those really big issues, perhaps, particularly if there are sort of attacks or verbal abuse towards staff, how are those issues generally tackled?
I think it's fair to say that it's not that there are no removals from school, suspensions in Scottish education. I think it's fair to say that there probably has been a culture of trying to limit the number, particularly because the way that they're reported through the local authority and through freedom of information requests, it shows, which local authorities perhaps have more of these than others. I believe from my own experience, it can come very much from the culture of your senior management team as to how these are handled. When it comes to restorative practices, there will be a set of opening conversations to have with the pupils who are misbehaving, a process to then escalate that to your line manager and above should it be not satisfactorily resolved. But in the middle of a misbehaviour, in the heat of that conversation, it takes a lot to be able to stick to the steps of, not accusing with how did you feel when this happened, and not make it accusing of the pupil, and that takes a lot of building up an experience to get confident with that, and particularly the new teachers, that can be a very difficult process to handle. Hopefully that answers your question, Lizzie.
Yeah, no, I'm sure I can imagine that would be quite an intimidating situation to be in if there are. I mean, I remember having quite a serious verbal and physical, not personally attacked, but I remember once having a chair thrown at me. Thankfully, it didn't go anywhere near me. I suppose it was an attack. It wasn't successful. And obviously that student was removed straight away. And yeah, lots of other sort of steps were taken to stop that. In that kind of case, would that student be removed, or would that be a kind of an immediate, how are you feeling in this moment? How would that be resolved? I'm trying to understand, because I know that physical attacks have been something that seem to have risen faster in Scottish schools than perhaps in other areas. And I'm just wondering, I suppose that there could be lots and lots of reasons for that. We don't necessarily have all the information to unpick why there could be dysregulated children, incidents of aggression happening. But I guess my question is, do Scottish teachers feel safe? And how can Christians be kind of thinking wisely about this in a way that shows compassion, but also is kind of resolute in understanding right and wrong?
again, from my own personal experience in a secondary school and being the head of my department, when it came to physical violence, that would be out in taken to senior management straight away. That would not be come out into the corridor and let's discuss why you threw a chair at me.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
understand completely in primary schools and within special educational needs schools that there can be physical violence from students there, and how they handle it may have to differ. However, when it comes to physical violence within a secondary school, it wouldn't go through that process, Lizzie.
Sure. But
And-
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear that, because I can imagine that if that was a kind of a daily experience, and you didn't necessarily feel that you were being protected at school, then that could be something that would cause you to the very short sort of lifespan in that school or in that profession. And and I'm sure that is still in the minority. I'm sure it's not that every student is attacking someone every day in school at all, or every teacher is being attacked. But it's just, I've just been aware of some of those differences.
I think in primary schools, just that there can be, and I've spoken to friends who have experienced that there can be, through children with additional support needs, acts of physical violence, I guess you would call it, and it can take longer to resolve that, predominantly because, and without wanting to get political, the resources available to properly support students with these needs. And that's a very sad situation across, no doubt, the whole of the UK, that the financial investment in supporting these pupils is not there as it used to be.
Sure. So what you call additional support needs in England and Wales would be called special educational needs.
Yes.
That's correct. And actually, one of your former trustees is now one of our trustees, and we've co-opted her to help us get a better awareness of what it's like at the coalface, or at the chalkface, at the chalkboard in Scotland, because we really want to work in partnership with our Scottish colleagues and with our Scottish brothers and sisters in Christ. So, thinking about partnership, how can we pray for one another? What are the needs of Scottish teachers and school staff now, and what would the kind of priorities for prayer be?
Yes, I think that what we can pray for is the pressures that our Scottish teachers are in with regards to the culture and ideological thinking that is going on at the moment. This fear of saying the wrong thing, or saying something that either a pupil or a parent, from a pupil passing on to a parent, is going to take and escalate to senior management about that they're unhappy with. And that anxiety about professional repercussions is real. And really to pray for staff, for boldness, for protection, for the understanding to know their permission and boundaries. And long before I started in CV Scotland, colleagues prepared a great number of resources on that you can get through our website about permissions and boundaries within Scottish education. The marginalisation of the faith, for many teachers, they may feel like they're the only Christian teacher within their school. Some teachers maybe don't even, in fact, I'll share this with you without obviously naming names. I was speaking to somebody the other day there who was saying that they only found out that their colleague was a Christian when they actually attended a joint event one weekend, and they'd been working together for a couple of years.
Wow.
So that, both very hard working within their churches, both keen to get involved work within the community, but within their workplace, they just felt that they were unable to share their faith. So that would be definitely worthy of prayer for their own actual health issues as well, for their own mental health struggles and anxiety. Teachers dealing with family breakdowns, children's ill health, as well as caring and wanting to show love for those in front of them, can be very, very draining. And the three of us are all teachers here. We know what it was like when you got to your holiday time and then you were ill within that first week because
Yeah.
your system was so praying for that, but praying also for, in a positive sense, for us to take the opportunities that are given to us to be able to share Christ with those within our schools. I know that when I joined teaching, I was a little bit older. I was 36, and I just prayed that I would get that opportunity to be able to share with the pupils in a way that was allowed. And that, for me, that was through a lunchtime group, and pupils knew my Christian faith, but they knew when I was in the classroom that I didn't take off my Christianity, but they knew that they could come to me out with that. And it was because it's optional. Our head senior management team were quite happy for that to take place. And, for teachers to take up these opportunities, should they be able to do so with the time demands. I think also being able to shape education from within these curriculum improvement cycles that are going on just now, and how that will actually play out with regards to the E's and O's in schools. But for us to be bold to say, well, within the confines of our framework here, we can make mention of Christians, perhaps from Scotland's past, for example, who have shaped who Scotland are. And the reason why they did this was because of the values of Christianity that are the values within Scottish education too. So being able to take that opportunity too, and to be able to show that compassion for those within the classroom who are struggling.
Of which there are many, absolutely. And just a brief, one more brief question about, because we've not really touched on some of the slightly more sensitive topics that many teachers in England, Christian teachers and others, have been very concerned about with regards to quite a lot of ideological material in lessons, etc. Particularly a couple of years ago, a lot of quite biased and unscientific material about things like gender identity, etc. Have they also had quite a prominence in Scottish schools?
Yes, and actually, the Scottish Government just last month published a long-awaited update to the guidance on delivery of relationship, sexual health and parenthood education, or RSHP, as it's known within here. And that has just been published. And if you go to the CV Scotland website, we've updated in our news section a little bit about, for a Christian teacher, what that update means. Of particular note, or certainly from my point of view when I was reading it, was on pages 14 and 15, is this section on religion, faith and belief, whole school guidance. And it says, teachers, and I'm going to quote verbatim here, teachers and practitioners are expected to be open to discussion and incorporation of the various perspectives of relationships found within the community, including those within religious beliefs and faith groups. Schools and settings can consider building links with local belief group representatives who can often help with understanding the concerns of members of their community. Those schools and settings are expected to satisfy themselves that such representatives are indeed representative of the community they align with, in line with standards and policies set by their local authority. So that has actually given, Scottish Christian teachers the opportunity, or at least in writing now, to be able to say, as long as we present it as a viewpoint of Christians with regards to these relationships, that can be incorporated. One of this major piece of work was long before I started with CV Scotland, is that we have resources that can be used within the RSHP curriculum, particularly for levels 3, 3rd level, 4th level and senior stage. Free lesson plans, PowerPoints, handouts, and notes for teachers that take the A's and O's that have been there, but removes parts that were extra, that were added unnecessarily, that would be contrary to what Christians would feel were acceptable to be taught to their children. So yes, you can register to have that free. And also we were in partnership with the Western Isles Local Authority, that they've done something similar for early years, 1st and 2nd levels, that we can link to their blog where you can get their lesson plans too.
Sure. Now, one of the things I must say is that your CVE Scotland's website is quite astounding in terms of how many materials you have on there. Probably the majority of them are helpful for use in schools with assemblies and in lessons as well. But I've been really impressed at the quality of materials on there and the range of them as well. So I would say to anyone, whether you're Scottish or whether you're, living and working in a different part of the UK or anywhere really, there are some really excellent resources there. And just tell us very briefly as we come to a close then, how can we find out more about you? And is there anything going on that we need to know about with CVE Scotland so that people can get more involved and support you?
Can I give you that one, Megan?
Well, you've heard Lynn, our outreach administrator, speaking, and you can see that she knows an awful lot and she's a wonderful worker. So really just get in touch with Lynn. And you can find Lynn's address on the website, and that's one way. We're very, very grateful to have Lynn working in CVE Scotland. She works 20 hours a week. They're very, very elastic, these 20 hours.
Oh yeah, I know how that feels.
I think as well, to Megan doesn't want to say, but we've been blessed to have Megan as our chair for 8 years. Would that be right, Megan? Though I know you've been on no, maybe, yeah, you can correct me, but
sure.
it's due to our constitution and also her other commitments, both at home and with her work with SIM. Megan steps down at the end of this month, so we're very, very sad to be losing her from the management committee, but delighted she's going to continue as a volunteer. But we give thanks to God for her wisdom and her direction and her drive to really have us consider our new focus. CVE Scotland was stretched very, very thin, serving parents, serving chaplains, serving school staff, serving pupils, and that new focus on Christian teachers and school workers, I think was definitely the right way to go. And we've got a lot to give thanks to God for Megan's service in that.
Great. Well, and one way that people can get involved is by coming to because we're hosting a joint meetup. I think, no, remind me, is that April the 23rd?
It is. It's 7:30 to 8:30.
So we'll attach the details to this of how you can book on, just free opportunity to come and touch base if you are working in schools or volunteering in schools and you want some Christian encouragement, a place to just chat about what you're doing, perhaps pray together as well. Then there'll be that online meeting. So wherever you are in Scotland, from the Highlands and the Islands to, I don't know, somewhere on the borders, we'd absolutely love to meet you and get to know you. And that's a joint ACT and CVE Scotland event. So yeah.
If I could add just one thing, sorry,
Yeah.
Lizzie.
No.
Just one thing. We're currently at CVE Scotland going to launch a survey of Scottish teachers and school workers to really find out more about what they would like us to do to try and support them better. That link is on our website. It's going out in our newsletter, and we're hoping that local authorities will be able to distribute that within their schools as well. But we'd really encourage Scottish teachers and school workers to complete that so that we think we know what they might want the way of support, but actually living and breathing it as they do, we would really appreciate that feedback. So if you can take the time to fill it in, it would only take about 5 minutes or so. That would be greatly encouraged.
Great. And if it helps, we can ask our Scottish members as well. You may
Sure.
not have many, but it's always helpful to get that in-person feedback. Great. Well, thank you so much. Just quickly tell us your website.
So it's www.cve-scotland.org.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing more of you. Take care.
Thank you, Lindsay.